The road doesn't have a name that most people remember. It curves through southern Virginia farmland, cutting between fields that have been planted, abandoned, and replanted for more than a century. Fence lines don't always match the maps anymore. Some lean where they were rebuilt after storms. Others mark boundaries no one can clearly explain. Ownership here has always been something inherited through memory as much as paperwork, passed down in conversations rather than courthouses. For generations, land along this back road changed hands quietly. A handshake after harvest, a verbal agreement made at the edge of a field, a promise that everyone remembered, but few ever wrote down. It worked because people knew each other, or at least they thought they did. But over time, farms shrank, families moved away, and land that once held only corn and timber began to carry different value. Roads were widened, utilities crept closer. Developers started asking questions. Suddenly, what had always been understood needed to be proven. The disputed parcel sat just off the road, a stretch of uneven ground, bordered by woods on one side and pasture on the other. It wasn't impressive to look at, but surveys suggested it connected multiple properties in ways that could unlock access, resale, and future construction. The problem was simple on the surface and poisonous underneath. The deed that defined its ownership could not be found. County records showed inconsistencies going back decades, a filing number that led nowhere, a reference to a transfer that never appeared in the index. Old clerks had retired or died. Copies were rumored to exist, but no one could produce them. Some claimed the land belonged to one family. Others insisted it had been split years earlier and leased informally. Everyone involved believed they were right. And because the land had never caused trouble before, no one had ever forced the issue. That changed when the meeting was scheduled. 14 men agreed to gather along the road that morning. There was no official notice, no law enforcement present. It wasn't a legal proceeding. It was framed as a conversation, a chance to lay everything out and finally resolve who owned what. The men represented different sides of the dispute. Some were landowners. Some were laborers who had worked the fields for years. A few had been brought in because they knew the history. They arrived in separate vehicles, parking along the shoulder, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. They were not strangers to one another. Some had worked together. Others had argued before, usually ending with nothing settled. A few were uneasy about being there at all. One man had mentioned to his wife the night before that the whole thing felt rushed. Another told a neighbor that the missing deed had turned people sharp. But no one expected violence. Not here. Not over paper. The air was still when they gathered, heavy with the smell of damp soil and cut grass. The road carried little traffic. A truck passed early on, slowing briefly, then disappearing around the bend. Voices stayed low. There was no shouting at first, just overlapping explanations and repeated claims of memory. Who had paid taxes? Who had maintained the land? Who had permission? And from whom? The conversation circled the same points again and again. Someone brought up the deed directly. The original document. The proof that could settle everything. It was supposed to exist. It had been referenced too many times not to, but no one had it. And the longer that absence hung in the air, the more the tone changed. Calm gave way to frustration. Frustration edged toward accusation. There were moments when it almost broke apart. When a few men stepped back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the tree line rather than the faces in front of them. Someone suggested postponing the meeting, involving lawyers, letting the county sort it out. That suggestion didn't land well. Lawyers meant records. Records meant scrutiny. And scrutiny threatened more than just pride. Small details began to feel wrong. A vehicle parked farther away than necessary. A man who arrived late and said little. Another who seemed more interested in who was present than in the land itself. No one articulated the unease clearly, but it was there, moving quietly between them. The meeting drifted closer to the woods, as if the road itself no longer felt neutral. Voices rose briefly, then dropped again. There was talk of money now, of what the land could be worth if sold together instead of in pieces, of who would lose if the deed resurfaced. One man said plainly that some things were better left buried. The words landed harder than he intended. Then everything fractured. The first gunshot didn't sound like a gunshot to everyone. In open country, sharp noises travel strangely. Some thought it was a truck backfiring. Others didn't have time to think at all. The second shot came too, fast, followed by another. The sound cut through the trees, echoing unevenly, impossible to place. Men scattered instinctively, some dropping to the ground, others running toward the woods or back toward their vehicles. There were shouts, panicked and incoherent, cut short almost as soon as they began. The gunfire didn't stop. It came in controlled bursts, deliberate, not wild. Whoever was firing knew where to aim and when to move. The road that had been quiet for decades absorbed the violence without resistance. Shell casings struck dirt and grass. Bodies fell, where moments earlier there had been conversation. Some men tried to crawl. Others never moved again. The woods swallowed sound and motion, offering cover to one person and none to the rest. When the gunfire finally stopped, silence returned too quickly. No engines started. No one screamed. The air settled back into stillness, broken only by distant birds startled into flight. From the road, it was impossible to tell how many had been hit. From the fields, nothing looked different at all. And somewhere between the trees and the abandoned paperwork that had brought them there, the full weight of what had just happened had not yet revealed itself. It was a passing driver who made the call, someone who had taken that road 100 times before and almost didn't slow down. Vehicles pulled over along the shoulder were not unusual here. People met, argued, fixed fences, settled things informally. But something about the stillness felt wrong. Doors stood open. No one waved. No one moved. When the driver stepped out and saw the first body, face down near the tree line, the brain refused to accept it. By the time the call reached the county dispatcher, the voice on the line was shaking, struggling to explain how many men there were without sounding unbelievable. Local deputies were the first to arrive. They expected a fight, maybe one shooting. What they found instead broke every assumption they had about the scale of violence this place could hold. Bodies lay scattered along the road and into the woods, not clustered, not piled, but separated, as if each man had been hunted to where he fell. Some were near their vehicles. Others were deeper among the trees. None were standing. None were alive. Training took over, but only partially. Deputies moved cautiously, weapons drawn, calling out even though there was no answer. They checked pulses they already knew they wouldn't find. Radios crackled as more units were requested, then state police, then medical examiners. The road was sealed off in both directions, yellow tape stretching across ground that had not seen anything like it in living memory. 14 adult men, all dead. Every one of them had been shot, not at extreme range, not execution style in a line. The wounds told a more complex story. Entry points varied. Some were struck while running, others while turning. One appeared to have been hit from the side, another from behind. This was not a chaotic spray of bullets. It was controlled, purposeful, and devastatingly effective. First responders struggled with the emotional weight almost immediately. Smaller departments prepare for tragedy, but not this. Not 14 families in one place. Not the sense that whoever did this had walked away untouched. Some officers later admitted they felt exposed standing there, scanning the woods long after the threat had passed, unable to shake the feeling that they were late to something carefully planned. As daylight shifted, the crime scene expanded. Each body became its own island of evidence. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, distances mapped. Shell casings were located in clusters, some near the road, others farther back, suggesting movement by the shooter rather than a fixed position. The pattern raised immediate questions. Had there been more than one shooter? Or had one person moved with terrifying efficiency? No weapon was found. No discarded firearm. No obvious escape path. Tire tracks were present, but the road saw regular traffic, and distinguishing relevant impressions from ordinary use was nearly impossible. Footprints in the dirt and grass overlapped, victims' movements blending together in the final moments. Without witnesses, everything had to be reconstructed from fragments. Medical examiners began preliminary assessments on site. Time of death estimates placed the shooting within a narrow window earlier that morning. There were no signs that the bodies had been moved afterward. This had happened fast, then ended abruptly. Blood patterns confirmed that most victims fell where they were struck. A few had crawled short distances before succumbing to their injuries. Investigators noted something else almost immediately. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a prolonged struggle. Whatever warning the men had, it was measured in seconds. Panic, then gunfire, then silence. The absence of spent ammunition near some bodies suggested they were hit while fleeing rather than being directly confronted. By late afternoon, the reality began to spread beyond the scene. Names were identified. Families were notified. In homes across the county, phones rang, and lives split into before and after. Some relatives had known about the meeting, others hadn't. None were prepared for the knock at the door that followed. Media arrived quickly. At first local, then regional. A rural Virginia county with 14 homicide victims was not something editors could ignore. Helicopters circled at a distance. Reporters stood behind tape, asking questions that deputies could not answer. Who did this? Why here? How could no one have seen anything? Law enforcement held back details, but the scale alone drew attention. State authorities took over coordination. Federal agencies offered resources. Ballistics experts were brought in to examine casing markings. Analysts began plotting trajectories, trying to determine shooter positions based on angles and impact points. The work was slow, meticulous, and haunted by the knowledge that answers might already be slipping away. Investigators were careful not to call it an ambush publicly, but privately, that word circulated. The positioning of the men, the controlled nature of the shots, the lack of hesitation. This did not look like a fight that escalated. It looked like something that had been decided before the first shot was fired. Still, without a suspect, theory remained just that. No one reported hearing gunfire nearby. No neighbor had seen someone fleeing. Cell phone records showed nothing obvious in the immediate aftermath. The shooter, or shooters, had vanished as cleanly as they arrived. As night fell, floodlights illuminated the road, casting long shadows over a place that felt permanently altered. Evidence technicians continued working, tagging, photographing, collecting, knowing that each small detail mattered. A casing overlooked, a footprint misread. In a case like this, mistakes would echo. By the time the last body was removed, exhaustion had set in, but sleep was impossible. Officers replayed the scene in their minds. 14 men. One meeting. No witnesses. No weapon. No clear motive yet beyond land, paper, and something someone wanted badly enough to kill for. And as investigators prepared to turn from the bodies themselves to the lives they represented, one question began to surface quietly among them. Whatever document had brought these men together, Whatever deed had gone missing might not just explain the dispute. It might explain why none of them were meant to walk away. Once the road was cleared and the evidence cataloged, the investigation shifted inward, away from the bodies and toward the lives that had intersected there. Detectives began with victimology, the slow, methodical work of understanding who the men were and why they had been in that place at the same time. At first, the connections seemed thin. Different ages, different backgrounds, some lifelong locals, others newer to the county. But as names were laid side by side, a single thread kept reappearing, quiet but consistent. Land. Not just land in the general sense, but one specific parcel tied to a deed that no one could produce. Every one of the 14 men had some level of involvement in a disputed transaction connected to that missing document. Some were listed as informal leaseholders. Others had paid taxes on portions of the property at different times. A few had signed handwritten agreements decades earlier, documents that carried weight locally but held little legal authority. One man had recently hired a surveyor. Another had spoken with a real estate attorney. On paper, it looked like coincidence. In context, it felt deliberate. Detectives began pulling property records from the county courthouse. The building itself was old, its archives layered with decades of paper, microfilm, and incomplete digitization. Clerks worked alongside investigators, bringing out dusty volumes, some barely touched in years. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. References to the parcel existed, but the trail kept breaking. A deed book number that led to a blank page, a transfer date without a corresponding filing, marginal notes written in different hands, some crossed out, others circled. Tax maps told a similar story. Boundaries shifted slightly over time, lines redrawn without explanation. In some years, one name appeared as responsible for payment. In others, a different one. No clear record explained why. It was as if the land had been passed around quietly, never fully claimed, never fully surrendered. That ambiguity mattered more than anyone had realized. Investigators learned that the county had recently approved preliminary plans for commercial development several miles away. New infrastructure was coming. Access roads, utilities. The disputed parcel, once considered marginal farmland, suddenly sat in a strategic position. With the right documentation, it could unlock access to adjacent properties, increasing their value dramatically. Millions of dollars were now part of the equation. As detectives interviewed families, stories began to overlap. Some victims had spoken recently about pressure, about being asked, sometimes aggressively, to sign documents they didn't fully trust. Others had been warned to stay out of it. One man had told his brother that the deed was more trouble than it was worth. Another believed someone was deliberately keeping it hidden. Early suspects emerged naturally. Land brokers who stood to profit, family members involved in inheritance disputes, business partners who had fallen out over money. But each lead, when examined closely, failed to account for the scale of violence. 14 men were not killed to silence one obstacle. This was something broader, something that required removing everyone who could claim a stake. Investigators began to consider that the missing deed wasn't simply misplaced. It may have been removed intentionally, stripped from the public record to preserve uncertainty. As long as ownership remained unclear, no one could challenge the status quo. But if the document resurfaced, it would end arguments permanently, assigning legal control and exposing who had benefited from the confusion. That possibility reframed the entire case. The deed itself became the central absence. Detectives reconstructed its existence through references alone. They found mentions of it in old loan applications, cited as collateral. In estate documents, it was acknowledged, but not attached. A retired clerk remembered seeing it once, years ago, but couldn't recall what became of it. No one could say for certain when it vanished, only that at some point, it stopped being accessible. The men who gathered on the road had all, in one way or another, been circling that absence. Some wanted the deed found and filed properly. Others wanted it validated in their favor. A few may have wanted it to remain lost forever. The meeting itself now looked less like a negotiation and more like a moment of reckoning, one that threatened to collapse years of quiet manipulation. Detectives ran background checks, financial records, communication logs. They looked for recent payments, sudden debts, unusual transfers. There were hints of motive scattered everywhere, but nothing clean enough to act on. Everyone had something to gain or lose. No one had an obvious reason to kill 14 people in broad daylight and disappear without trace. As weeks passed, pressure mounted. The media framed the case as a massacre over land, but that explanation felt too simple. Land disputes happened all the time without ending in blood. This was different. This required planning, resources, and a willingness to destroy an entire group to protect a secret. Investigators returned again and again to the courthouse, combing through private collections donated by retired attorneys, scanning boxes of personal papers that families allowed them to see. In one set of files, they found a handwritten note referencing a duplicate deed, created years earlier for safekeeping. No copy accompanied it. The note ended abruptly, unsigned. That discovery changed the tone inside the task force. If a duplicate existed, it meant the original was never the only proof. Someone, somewhere, may still have a copy. And if that copy surfaced, it wouldn't just clarify ownership, it would expose intent. The missing deed was no longer just a bureaucratic problem. It was the reason 14 men were dead. And as investigators began to understand who had access to records, who knew how to make documents disappear quietly, and who stood to lose everything if the truth came out, the case shifted again, narrowing its focus. The road had been the site of the violence, but the courthouse, with its empty spaces and erased history, was where the motive lived. And somewhere between those two places, someone had decided that protecting a piece of paper was worth more than 14 lives. In the weeks after the funerals, the county changed in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. People still went to work. Stores stayed open. Fields were still tended. But conversations shortened. Doors closed sooner in the evenings. Trucks slowed near the backroad and then sped up again, as if the place itself had become something to escape rather than pass through. Investigators felt it almost immediately. Phone calls that had once been returned went unanswered. Neighbors who had spoken freely in the first days now said they couldn't remember details they had been sure of before. A man who had mentioned seeing unfamiliar vehicles near the road called back to clarify that he might have been mistaken. Another asked to withdraw a statement entirely, apologizing without explanation. Fear didn't announce itself loudly. It settled quietly, shaping behavior. People avoided being seen talking to law enforcement. Meetings were canceled. Long-standing grudges went unspoken again. The massacre had sent a message, whether intended or not, and the county seemed to understand it instinctively. Rumors filled the silence. Some said there had been threats before the meeting, warnings that certain names shouldn't be involved. Others whispered about intimidation afterward, about visits that didn't leave marks but didn't need to. There were stories of powerful families who had controlled land for generations, who knew which records mattered and which could be made to disappear. None of it was concrete enough to act on. All of it was enough to keep people quiet. Inside the investigation, progress slowed. Detectives requested records that should have existed, only to be told they were sealed, lost, or destroyed under retention policies no one could fully explain. A few clerks were openly defensive, insisting they had done nothing wrong. Others seemed genuinely frightened, their voices dropping when certain years or filing numbers were mentioned. The courthouse, once a place of answers, became a maze of locked doors and partial truths. Requests for older documents required approvals that took weeks, then months. Some files arrived incomplete. Others came with pages missing entirely. It was difficult to prove whether this was incompetence, coincidence, or something more deliberate. As leads dried up, investigators began debating the nature of the crime itself. One theory suggested organized involvement, multiple shooters, coordinated planning, resources that exceeded what one person could manage alone. The other theory pointed toward a single orchestrator, someone with deep knowledge of the land, the people, and the records, capable of manipulating others into being present and vulnerable at the same time. Neither theory brought comfort. Organized involvement implied a network that could outlast the investigation. A lone orchestrator implied someone who knew the county so well they could vanish inside it. Families grew restless. Grief turned into anger, then desperation. They attended town meetings. They called news stations. They demanded to know why no arrests had been made, why no names were being named. Investigators listened, often in silence, unable to offer the certainty the families wanted. Privately, officers felt the weight of the case settling into them. Some couldn't sleep. Others replayed interviews in their minds, wondering if they had missed a moment, a hesitation, a glance that meant more than it seemed. The fear that the truth might never surface wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal. Tips still came in, but they were thinner now, less specific. Anonymous calls spoke in generalities. "Everyone knows who did it," one caller said, without explaining who everyone was. Another hinted at documents kept in a private collection, then hung up before giving a name. Each call raised hope briefly, then let it fall again. The back road itself became a symbol. People avoided it unless they had to. Those who lived nearby reported unfamiliar vehicles slowing down, then turning away. No one claimed to see anything suspicious, but everyone seemed alert, watching without wanting to be noticed watching. As months passed, the investigation entered a dangerous phase, not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. Silence has a way of convincing people that nothing will change, that justice is negotiable, that the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of waiting. Detectives continued working, quietly, methodically, refusing to let the case die publicly, even as it cooled privately. They revisited evidence, reran timelines, re-interviewed witnesses who would still talk. Each small effort felt like pushing against something heavy and unmoving. And beneath it all, the missing deed remained, an absence that shaped every conversation. It was never named directly in public anymore, but everyone knew it was still there, unresolved, unfiled, and dangerous. Whatever power structures existed in the county, whatever fear held people in place, all of it seemed to orbit that single piece of paper. The question investigators began asking themselves was no longer just who pulled the trigger. It was whether the truth, once uncovered, would be allowed to stand at all. And as the county grew quieter and the road returned to its familiar stillness, the fear settled in that the massacre might not be the end of the story, but the warning that ensured it stayed buried. Time passed in a way that felt almost insulting to the families. Seasons changed, headlines faded, new cases replaced old ones. The road where 14 men died returned to being just another stretch of asphalt, quiet enough that someone unfamiliar with the story could drive it without ever knowing what had happened there. Inside law enforcement, the case was no longer active in the way it once had been. It was reviewed periodically, discussed in low voices, but officially, it was cold. detectives retired or transferred. New officers were briefed on the basics, but without fresh leads, the massacre became something they studied rather than chased. Evidence remained boxed and cataloged. Ballistics reports sat in files, marked inconclusive. The missing deed was still missing, and for a long time, it seemed like that was how the story would end. 14 men dead. No arrests, no resolution. Then, years later, a civil dispute quietly reopened a door no one expected. It wasn't connected to the murders on its face. Two parties were arguing over access rights to a neighboring parcel, a disagreement that required historical clarification of boundary lines. As part of the process, attorneys requested archived land records that hadn't been examined in decades. Boxes were pulled from storage, private collections were reviewed, and buried inside a legal file that had never been digitized, never indexed properly, sat a document no one was supposed to find. A duplicate deed. It wasn't the original, but it didn't need to be. It bore the same language, the same property description, and critically, a chain of signatures that matched references investigators had seen but never been able to confirm. The deed established clear ownership of the disputed land at a point in time that invalidated several later claims entirely. It named beneficiaries. It closed loopholes. And it explained, in stark legal terms, who truly owned the land and who had been operating in a gray area ever since. When word reached law enforcement, the reaction was cautious disbelief. Detectives who had lived with the case for years were called back in. The document was verified, examined by experts, compared against known records. Every detail held up. The deed was real, and it rewrote the entire narrative. According to the document, one individual, previously considered peripheral to the dispute, had held legitimate ownership through a corporate entity that masked direct control. Over time, others had been allowed to use the land under informal arrangements, some knowingly, others not. As long as the deed stayed buried, those arrangements could be manipulated, taxes could be shifted, claims could be blurred. But if the deed ever became public, it would expose years of quiet profit and potential fraud. The meeting on the road suddenly made terrible sense. The men who gathered that day were not random stakeholders. They were claimants, witnesses, people whose signatures, testimony, or challenges could have forced the deed into the open. Some wanted clarity. Some wanted leverage. A few may have believed they were close to uncovering the truth. From the perspective of the person named in the duplicate deed, they were all liabilities. Investigators reopened everything. Ballistics were pulled from storage and re-examined with updated technology. Patterns that had once seemed inconclusive now aligned more clearly. Shell casings matched a limited range of firearms. Trajectory analysis suggested a single shooter moving methodically, not multiple attackers. The idea of a chaotic ambush gave way to something colder, more controlled. Old interviews were revisited with fresh context. Statements that once seemed vague now read as careful. Hesitations took on new meaning. One suspect, interviewed early and dismissed due to lack of apparent motive, now stood out sharply. At the time, there had been no reason to believe they would benefit directly from the deaths. Now, with the deed in hand, the motive was overwhelming. Financial records confirmed it. In the years following the massacre, the land had been consolidated quietly. Development deals moved forward without objection. Profits flowed through layers of accounts designed to obscure origin. Nothing illegal on its face, unless you knew what had been removed to make it possible. Detectives realized something else that was harder to process. The killings were not driven by anger, fear, or loss of control. They were strategic. Every man present had been selected by circumstance. The timing, the location, the absence of witnesses all pointed to a plan designed to end claims permanently. The psychological weight of that conclusion hit harder than the violence itself. This wasn't a moment that got out of hand. It was an execution of opportunity. As the investigation accelerated again, fear returned to the county in a different form. Subpoenas were issued, records demanded. People who had stayed silent for years were suddenly being asked to speak under oath. Some complied reluctantly, others lawyered up. The power structures that had once felt untouchable began to crack under scrutiny. For investigators, the realization was both vindicating and unsettling. They had been right to believe the deed mattered, but they were also forced to confront how close the truth had come to staying buried forever. If not for an unrelated civil dispute, the document might still be sitting in a forgotten box, and 14 murders would remain officially unsolved. As prosecutors reviewed the case, one question dominated every meeting. Could this be proven beyond doubt? The evidence was circumstantial, but layered. Motive was now clear. Opportunity had always been there, and the deed explained not just why the men died, but why the case had been so effectively stalled. The break that shouldn't have happened had finally arrived, and with it came a reckoning that many in the county had spent years hoping would never come. When the case finally moved again, it did so without ceremony. There was no announcement, no press conference at first, just paperwork. Warrants drafted carefully, reviewed line by line, built on years of silence, and a single document that had survived being hidden. Investigators knew that if they rushed now, they risked losing everything. What they were preparing wasn't just an arrest. It was an explanation for 14 deaths that had haunted a county for more than a decade. The duplicate deed became the spine of the case. Prosecutors laid it out chronologically, showing how ownership had been consolidated through shell entities, how informal agreements were encouraged and then exploited, how ambiguity was used as leverage. The deed proved that the land had never been as contested as it appeared. One person, acting through intermediaries, had controlled it all along. That control came with motive. Financial records showed the shift clearly once investigators knew where to look. In the years after the massacre, parcels that had once been leased informally were sold cleanly. Development agreements were signed without opposition. Easements were granted that had previously been blocked. The profits didn't appear overnight, but they accumulated steadily, quietly, moving through accounts designed to look ordinary. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. It was only when those financial gains were overlaid with the timing of the murders that the picture sharpened. The men who died had been obstacles, whether they realized it or not. Some had been preparing to challenge ownership. Others had been approached to testify in civil matters. A few simply knew too much about the land's history to be ignored. The meeting on the backroad wasn't spontaneous. Phone records and calendars showed coordination. The location was suggested under the pretense of neutrality, a place tied to the land, but not owned outright by any one party. The timing was chosen carefully, early enough that most people would still be at work, remote enough that help wouldn't arrive quickly. Ballistics, reinterpreted with modern analysis, supported what the deed implied. The shooter's movement pattern matched someone familiar with the terrain, someone who knew where to step, where not to. A person who had walked that land many times before. When the arrest finally came, it was quiet. No resistance. The suspect was older now, respected in some circles, largely forgotten in others. They had lived openly in the county the entire time, attending community events, contributing to local causes. To some neighbors, the news felt impossible. To others, it felt overdue. The charges were sweeping. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud-related offenses tied to the land transactions that followed. The defense pushed back hard, arguing circumstantial evidence, questioning the chain of custody on the deed. suggesting alternative explanations that relied on coincidence and doubt. But the story, once laid out fully, held. Witnesses who had stayed silent for years came forward when they realized the protection they feared was no longer absolute. Some admitted to being pressured. Others acknowledged altering records or looking the other way, not for money, but for safety. Their testimony didn't excuse what happened, but it explained how it was allowed to continue. In court, the focus was never on spectacle. There were no dramatic outbursts. Families listened quietly as the final moments of their loved ones were reconstructed through evidence and expert testimony. It was painful, precise, and unavoidable. Each fact removed a layer of mystery and replaced it with something heavier. The verdict came after days of deliberation. Guilty. On every count that mattered. For the families, justice didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as confirmation. Confirmation that they hadn't imagined the scale of what had been taken from them. Confirmation that the silence they endured wasn't accidental. Confirmation that the men they lost had died because they stood in the way of something valuable enough to kill for. Sentencing closed the legal chapter, but it didn't close the story. The land itself became evidence of the cost. Development continued, but now under scrutiny, every transaction examined for traces of what had been erased to make it possible. Portions were frozen in litigation. Others were sold again, this time with clean records that acknowledged what had happened there. The county changed slowly after that, not dramatically. There were no celebrations. But conversations began to loosen. People spoke more openly about the past, about who had held power and how it had been protected. The courthouse reviewed its archival practices. Records were digitized. Oversight increased. Small changes, born from something enormous. The backroad remains. It still curves through farmland and woods, still quiet most days. There is no marker listing names, no official memorial. Locals know where it happened, but they don't point it out to strangers. The land doesn't announce its history, it holds it. What the deed cost can't be measured cleanly. 14 lives were taken to protect a piece of paper that existed only to control profit and access. Years of fear followed. Trust eroded. A community learned how easily silence can be maintained when power goes unchallenged. The massacre is no longer a mystery. The evidence speaks clearly now. But resolution doesn't erase absence. Families still set places at tables that will never be filled. Children grew up without fathers. Brothers aged carrying questions that answers can't fully satisfy. In the end, the story isn't about land alone. It's about how easily harm can hide behind bureaucracy, how violence doesn't always announce itself loudly, and how justice, even when delayed, still has the ability to expose the truth. The deed is on file now, where it always should have been. Its existence no longer threatens anyone. And that may be the quietest, most devastating proof of all.